Hello, and welcome to Stories from India, a podcast where we talk about myths, legends, and folk tales from India. I am your host, Narad Muni, and I'm a mythological character myself. I have the gift of eternal life and knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. By profession, I'm a traveling musician and a storyteller. So, the way I'm doing my job is by podcast. In this episode, we are continuing the story of the Mahabharat. If you have not heard the previous Mahabharat episodes, I recommend you check those out. Here's a summary of the story so far. King Shantanu of Hastinapur met and married Ganga, the river goddess, who also happens to be my sister. Ganga, as a condition, made Shantanu promise that he would never ever question her. Shantanu kept his promise, at least until after she had drowned their first 7 babies. When she tried the same thing on the 8th baby, Shantanu decided that he had had enough. So he stopped her. That had the effect that instead of drowning the baby, she merely took him away. She said she would return the child at some point, but never actually gave him an ETA. And that left Shantanu waiting indefinitely. We'll pick up the story right here. Every day, Shantanu had one routine. And despite being the emperor of Hastinapur, that routine did not include most emperor duties. Shantanu was content to leave it all to his ministers and his deputies. He only looked out at the river Ganga every chance he got. He had even had a tower added to his palace just so that he could observe the river. The fact that his focus was fully fixated on Ganga was not lost on the citizens of the kingdom. They were quite aware of this. And in fact, they even had a bet going at all the major taverns. Bookmakers were offering 7 to 5 odds that Shantanu was waiting for Ganga's return, and 4 to 8 odds that it was his 8th child that he was waiting for. Some even suggested that he was really waiting for a Ganga substitute, noting that he had not married anyone else in the several years since Ganga left him. One enterprising bookmaker even offered to take bets that Shantanu was really studying the river in order to solve irrigation problems for his citizens. The Ganga was not the Nile, and Shantanu was no pharaoh. But who could rule that out? Could well be a long shot coming home for a punter. But it was just a desperate attempt by the tavern owner / bookkeeper to rescue his dying business. If nothing, the press got a good laugh about it. And that meant free publicity. It had been several years now since Ganga left. Besides the occasional sighting of a river dolphin in the Ganga, there was only one interesting thing that had happened to Shantanu. And that was the story of how he had adopted twins. I don't mean to imply that Shantanu stared at the river all the time. He did take the time to eat, drink, and sleep. As a backup for those times, Shantanu employed people whose only job it was to report any person or persons emerging from inside the river. Pretty easy job it was, especially as Shantanu gave them hammocks and also a lifetime supply of energy drinks. All they had to do was to call the hotline the moment they spotted anyone emerging from the river. One day, a soldier walked into Shantanu's palace and asked for an urgent audience. Shantanu's secretary insisted on some paperwork being filled out, but the soldier had a very valid excuse not to do so. "Can't you see?" he said. "My hands are full with these two adorable little babies." And so they were. The secretary fawned over them for a while before finally letting the soldier through. The soldier, when he met Shantanu, got straight to the point. He had been walking around in the forest, minding his own business, doing soldierly things, when he heard crying. Normally, if you're in a dark forest and you hear crying, you should steer clear of it. It's usually a trap. In this case, it was a parent trap, complete with twin babies. But there was something very unusual about the scene. There was a deerskin cloth, the kind typically worn by rishis, a bow, some arrows, and of course the twins themselves, a boy and a girl. Even though the infants had a bow and some arrows nearby, with which they could have defended themselves against any wild animals, the soldier wisely chose to take them to Shantanu. Shantanu had a solution, of course, because that's pretty much bread and butter for emperors. They were meant to resolve problems like these. Shantanu said that he would raise the babies himself. He said he would call them Kripa and Kripi. Kripa literally means pity, and Shantanu had chosen that because he was taking pity on the babies. And the girl's name, Kripi, would almost certainly lead to playground bullying, given how similar it sounded to the word creepy. Forcing the kids through life in ancient India with appalling names was almost as bad a crime as abandoning them in the forest in the first place. The soldier was now having second thoughts about having brought the babies to Shantanu. But it was probably too late. He did not object. Shantanu did ask the soldier to go through the records at the Lost and Found Center, the Gumshuda Talash Kendra, just to see if anyone had reported missing these babies. But no one had. After some years passed, Shantanu had Kripa and Kripi homeschooled. That was one way of solving the playground bullying problem. One day, a rishi showed up at Shantanu's palace. He introduced himself as Saradwan, the son of Gautam. Gautam is a Maharishi or a VIP of a rishi who features in many stories. We'll certainly encounter him in future episodes. Saradwan also explained that he was Kripa and Kripi's father. The story was a bit embarrassing, but he told it anyway. Once, while he was in the middle of a very long prayer project, just to acquire superpowers, Indra, the chief of the Devs, decided to interfere. Because that's what Indra does all the time. Some say he wants to avoid superpower proliferation because he's scared of others becoming more powerful than himself. Sort of like how all the major nuclear superpowers of the contemporary world have pretty much forced everyone else not to create nuclear weapons after they have built up their own stockpiles. Anyway, that political view aside, Indra sent down Janpadi, an Apsara, to distract the Rishi. And that distraction obviously worked, given that Kripa and Kripi were born. So, I get the deerskin cloth, said Shantanu. That's standard Rishi clothing, so that makes sense. What about the bow and arrows? And more importantly, why did you leave them in the forest? Ah, the bow and arrows. Yes, I'd love to explain that, said Saradavan. I'm quite the expert when it comes to any kind of weapon. In fact, I was born clutching arrows. Even the doctors in the maternity ward were shocked. Oh my, exclaimed Shantanu. That must have been a very difficult pregnancy for your mother then. Oh, yes, yes. Anyway, let's talk about me and my knowledge of Astra and Shastra, the Sanskrit words for projectile and handheld weapons. He had completely ignored Shantanu's question about the reckless child endangerment. Shantanu seems to have forgotten that question as well, because he then proceeded to employ Saradwan to teach the very same children whom he had abandoned. A few more years passed after this. The river watching routine continued. One day, after several years, the king decided to take a rare evening off of river watching. And ironically, that was the day something happened with Ganga. The way Shantanu heard about it was from a group of farmers who came to complain to him that the river had been turned off. They blamed it all on beavers, which apparently one of them had partially read about, but without realizing that beavers did not exist in India. Anxiously, Shantanu headed for the river himself. He asked his appointees, who were chilling in hammocks, why they hadn't raised an alarm bell. But they had a quick, bureaucratic response. It was because he had only asked them to watch out for a person or persons emerging from the water, not other kinds of phenomena, natural or artificial. If he liked, they could provide him with a detailed report of incremental resources and budget required to expand their observation targets for the next 3 fiscal years. Not wanting to get into a protracted argument about that, Shantanu left the scene, promising to circle back to them in due course. Don't call me, I'll call you, he said. When he reached the river bank, he could see that by now the river had indeed dried up. He walked upstream and came upon what did in fact look like a beaver dam. Pesky beavers, he thought. How dare they build a dam on this holy river? But upon closer inspection, it was clear that these were very intelligent beavers. They seem to have mastered the art of metallurgy because the beaver dam was not made of wood, it was made of metal and steel. And standing near the dam was a handsome youth with a bow and arrows who seemed to be responsible for this. Shantanu prepared to challenge this youngster, and then the boy turned around and faced him. Shantanu was struck by how handsome he looked and how familiar he seemed. His eighth baby would have been about the same age. Could it be him? We'll leave it here for now. If you want to hear previous Mahabharat episodes, check out episode 59 and episode 60. There are links on the show notes, as well as on the site sfipodcast.com. In the next episode, we'll continue the story of Shantanu and Devvrat. We'll see how Shantanu just could not shake his father's dying words out of his head, and how tragic it was that he completely ignored his experience with prenuptial conditions. If you have comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories you'd like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or tweet at sfipodcast. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. Thanks to all of you listeners for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. I'll see you next time.